Hi, everyone. It's Dean Hutchison from the ABA and from Circle Surrogacy. We're going to get going in a couple minutes. I just wanted to get everyone in the room. All the panelists are here, but I'm just going to let it stay open for about 2 more minutes to get as many of the attendees in as possible. As usual, it's being recorded, so if you have to leave or jump off, I'll be circulating the recording afterwards. If you don't know, too, there's that question panel box on the right. You can start filling out any questions you have now. You can wait till you hear some of the people speak and maybe ask questions on what they say. But if you have specific questions you want us to get to, you can start filling out questions right now. So we'll come back live in about 2 minutes. All right, we're going to get started and get this going. So I just want to say welcome to all of you who could join. I'm Dean Hutchison, the current chair of the ABA Art Committee, and I work at Circle Surrogacy and Weltman Law in Boston. We were hoping back in March, April, May that maybe we wouldn't need any more of these things and that they'd be over. But it seems like, as we were just joking in the panelist room, that March continues on. So we thought it'd be good to have an end of the summer, quick updates from different groups, and then take any questions you have in the room too, and get as many answers as we can out to you. It looks like we're going to be extended in pandemic world for the upcoming months too. If there are topics that we don't discuss tonight that you think maybe make a good presentation, or if you have other speakers that might be good that you've dealt with or worked with in the last 5-6 months while this has been going on, we'd love to hear and have some new faces here and there. But tonight, I want to thank the panelists that are here again. Allison Wilson is going to talk about kind of some mental health updates for both our parents, our surrogates, our donors, and even us, and how to continue dealing with this kind of never-ending extra workload stress. We're going to have Dr. Danishmand talk a little bit about any ASRM updates, any kind of how the practice is going and how the IVF procedures are going with new protocols in place, as well as what's any research studies out there and vaccine studies out there. We're going to have Mr. Stephen Snyder talk a little bit from a SEEDS update on what's going on from an agency side, as well as upcoming events from SEEDS, and then from a legal side, talking about kind of contracts, addendums. If someone has new protocols or gets quarantined, who's responsible for certain costs. After that, Rich Vaughn's going to speak about kind of that never-ending process of getting parents here and home. If there's been any updates, what's been working, what hasn't. And before all that too, I miss Sarah. She's going down the list. Sarah Page from Art Risk is going to talk any insurance updates, ACA, workers' comp, et cetera. And as I said, bring any questions you have on these topics. If we don't have them, we'll try and get answers to you. And any, also any commentary from you. If you hear something or see a question that you've dealt with recently, please feel free to put in the question box how you dealt with it or outcomes you've seen. From the ABA side, I just wanted to let everyone know, some of you and many of you have gone to the conference, particularly the lawyers, but the non-lawyers out there, it's appearing that we're most likely going to have a virtual conference. I'd be very surprised if it wasn't, but it's going to be a much lower cost, and there's some really good panels, one on kind of the big Cambridge summit we had a year ago, for those who weren't there, kind of the international and different views on surrogacy. There's going to be panels on COVID. There's going to be panels on kind of birthright citizenship, all some very interesting topics. And because it's virtual, it's going to be a much lower cost than usual. So we'd love to see some of the non-attorneys attend. And then next year, hopefully the next in-person one will be Palm Springs in May. But I'll let everyone know on the Surrogacy Professionals Board once we have our event scheduled and the final decision on whether it's virtual or not. So I'm going to start with Allison Wilson. Let me just get that slide up. Allison, I think I just unmuted you,
All
so
right.
make sure it's working.
Okay, yes.
I'm getting better with my slide creations too, as everyone can
Yeah.
see. I hope you all appreciate it.
I
But
really like that one.
the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And if you're attending for the first time and our ever-ending March, I'm Dr. Wilson. I'm a licensed psychologist. I practice out of Denver, Colorado. And as you may remember, for our intended parents, earlier in the pandemic, it was absolute fear and frustration. If the intended parents were already in the process and their surrogate was pregnant, there was just a lot of fear around, can we be there at the birth? How is that going to work for us? And then frustration that the clinics were closed. Since that time, I get a mixture of feelings. I think overall, many intended parents are just so relieved the clinics are back open. And where maybe 2 months ago they were worried it's going to shut down. It's going to shut down. And so there's that fear, but overall there's a relief that things are happening. And you have to remember, with this patient population, they've already experienced reproductive trauma, emotional trauma, and they know what it's like to have uncertainty. And this just adds on to it, and not knowing where this pandemic is going. But then I also hear that there is a sense that they're pleased they're able to take steps towards making this dream come true, even though they know the clinic might not be fully staffed or this is going to be delayed. At least they can do something, because I think the worst feeling is feeling helpless, or you're aimlessly, going around. So I do get that sense. Is there worry that will their baby be okay? Absolutely. But there is that overall dream of, want to grow our family, and that supersedes their fear. I'm also hearing just frustration that the support, typically they would go to in-person support group that clinics may offer or whatnot, but that's not happening, and they're having to go on Zoom calls, which can be really fatiguing and frustrating and hard to connect. But it is, again, the overall sense that at least the clinic's open and at least we're making some progress again. On the surrogate side, at least in my experience and colleagues I've talked to in different states, not seeing as many surrogates for mental health screenings or going through that process. I mean, just in the last week or two, I've seen an increase of screenings I'm needing to do. But I think it, again, for all of us, was this shock and going through that grieving of what is COVID, and then anger can surface, disbelief, sadness. I think we're all kind of in a state of this is feeling dismal or really down feeling. And so I think for surrogates, they weren't ready to just sign up and, hey, I'm going to go do this, when they weren't sure what the pandemic was looking like. A change that has happened is the screenings, the mental health screenings of surrogates. Depending upon where you are in the country, a lot of the mental health professionals are opting to do the mental health screenings via telehealth through a secured video platform. And that's pretty new. We would typically require all screenings to be done in person. And so what I'm seeing is the telehealth video or a hybrid type of screening where the mental health professional might do the interview portion of the screening with the surrogate online, through video, and then they might have them come into the office to do the testing in person. I think, at least in my practice, I do all telehealth just because it's incredibly difficult to assess somebody when they're wearing a mask the entire hour or two, and I'm wearing a mask, and that's such a disconnect. And it's not a very helpful way to try to screen somebody's mental health. And so that's been a change of seeing these telehealth screenings. I always inform intended parents that this is this is a change, and they need to be aware of that. And surrogates that I have screened, a lot of them, I always ask, what are your thoughts about doing this during COVID? And do you know risk? And how are you with this? And overall, the majority, if not all, have not really expressed that much fear around it. Of course, I'm getting a biased sample because they've already decided they want to do this, but they're not as scared as I thought they would be. Some out there might find other experiences for surrogates, but that's what I'm finding here in Colorado. I'm also finding that a lot of the surrogates I am starting to screen, they've thought about this pre-COVID, or they were planning to be a surrogate well before this pandemic came to us. So I was expecting a big rush for people who were financially, in a hard spot and were wanting to do this for the money. And I'm not really seeing that. Having said that, some of the surrogates I have screened haven't been the best of quality, just on their strength of their application. But overall, I would say they had already wanted to be a surrogate well before the pandemic. And now that they have time, they're able to pursue this. That's not so much true with donors. I have spoken with colleagues. It seems like since the pandemic, the quality of the donors that are being screened is lessened, and which makes one think that there's more of an incentive to do it for financial reasons. But I'm, again, not seeing that so much with surrogates. What I am finding in others are they're willing to be a surrogate, but many of them would prefer to do it in their home state or in a local situation, so they do not have to fly. And just for convenience sake, they would rather stay close to home. And then with regards to all of us being professionals, frontline in the field in this, it really can be so draining. And the longer this goes on, I think we're finding a pandemic in mental health. It is not uncommon to feel depressed, anxious, frustrated in that this isn't going away. And I think that denial system has been lifted, and for many people, they're recognizing that. And there's been a lot of uncertainty on how do you proceed, because back in March, when it was you are staying home, that was easier to follow those rules. But now it's so dependent upon the state you live, the city, the rules, what your neighbor's doing, and there's a lot of uncertainty. Should we go do this? Should we not? So there's lots of anxiety in that area. But overall, it's, again, that message: lean on your support system. If you feel like it's too much, then obviously talk to a mental health professional. That's why we're here. And it's helpful to talk it out. and then really to focus on self-care and continuing to make good choices as we keep on with this and never-ending march. So, but that's all I have for now. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I will pass it on to, I believe, Saeed. Dr. Danishman is next.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. Actually, it's Sarah, so I'm going to unmute Sarah. Sarah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
All right, you are up.
Okay. So I'm just going to give a quick update regarding there's still some states that are open for COVID, meaning that the open enrollment is open specifically for that. For those ones, there can't be any insurance, but those states are Vermont through 8/14, so Friday, New York through 8/15, California is through 8/31, DC is through 9/15, and Maryland has just extended it through 12/15. So their normal open enrollment, they just kind of moved everything in together. So those, again, are the states that are open for if nobody has insurance, but they want to get it, they're calling it a COVID special enrollment. Outside of that, there is still the ACA special enrollments, which means that there's a loss of insurance, or there's a move, or there's some form of a family shift, divorce, marriage, death. Again, there's been, because of COVID, there's definitely been some shifting around with moves as well as loss of insurance due to job losses. And so if that does happen, that does open up the Affordable Care Act in every state. And that's a qualifying event across the board. And then for the Affordable Care Act, the following states are actually open if a pregnancy occurs. This is considered a qualifying event in that state, which would be Connecticut, Vermont, New York, and Maryland. So those, again, are 4 states where if the GC does become pregnant, open enrollment or special enrollment will then be open for them to enroll. And then I do have some dates coming up for actual open enrollment starting November 1st and running through December 15th, which is very standard. There are 5 states right now that are going to extend it into January, which is California, Colorado, Washington, Pennsylvania, and Nevada. And so Colorado, Pennsylvania, and Nevada are going to be extending through January 15th. So they will be November 1st through January 15th. And then California and Washington will be November 1st through the 31st of January. California's a little bit different this year because last year it did open on 10/15, and they are not opening right now on 10/15. They are opening November 1st. So they're not opening earlier, but again, staying open later than they did. And then outside of the Affordable Care Act, so if for any reason right now, not in a state for COVID, knows no special enrollment, and they're not in a state that allows pregnancy as a special enrollment, then availabilities would be potentially a short-term policy, which can be 3, 6, 9, or 12 months. It covers complications, fairly inexpensive. It's a really good route to go. It does have some limitations on states. So there are more states that are covered than not, but I'm going to list the states that are not covered by the short term. So California does not offer it, Colorado does not offer, Connecticut, Hawaii, Massachusetts, Maine, New Mexico, New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, and Vermont. Again, those are states that do not have short-term insurance, but the rest of them do. So that might be an option if you have a GC not in one of those states. And then, of course, you still have on the Lloyd's market, which is New Life and Universal. There are options there with either a primary, bridge, and or a reimbursement. So there's options for them. And then also pregnancy care, which is open year round. And then kind of my last little tidbit that I just wanted to kind of push a little bit more is just with everybody, really starting to stay remote. There needs to be a nice consideration for any employees regarding workers' comp, because there's actually more potential risk with people working from home than there have been in the office. There's less that you can control in someone's house. And so I think if you do not have workers' compensation insurance, I think it's very, very important that you discuss that with a broker so that they can talk to you about what that looks like, what it covers, because again, you don't have control over that home environment and what it looks like, but yet as an employer, you are still responsible for that employee and their environment. So just keeping that open. And then just a quick thing, which I didn't add to this, and I apologize, was just with the cyber liability, again, more of us working from home, just making sure that you have processes and procedures in place within your offices so that you are as protected as possible, and that if anything does happen, that you definitely also have some form of insurance for that. So that is my little update for everything right now. So not a ton to update, but definitely ACA is coming up. So I know that that's a whole different beast.
Sarah, I have a couple quick questions before we get to Saeed that you may not even have an answer for yet.
Yeah.
Have you seen, or has there been any talk yet of what the potential premium deductible increases may be with the fact that 5 million people got COVID and X number of people have gotten treatment from it in the last year?
Yeah. So the deductible levels I haven't seen, but the out-of-pocket maximum is going to be 8,500, and I haven't seen any increase on that. The premiums, which normally, like the first 4 or 5 years, it was anywhere from a 30% to 15%, and last year it was really low, it was about a 4.5% increase. We're seeing rates now from states in the 6.9%. Some of them are 12%. So we are going to see a larger increase than we did last year, definitely.
Okay. And then second, if I get injured mowing my lawn while I'm working, do I get workers' comp, or is it? Just
yes,
kidding.
If either of the employees involved in our circle said you had to go mow your lawn, absolutely. Or if it's a stress reliever.
Very much so. Thank you very much. And again, anyone has any questions for insurance, Sarah's going to stay on, so she'll be back on at the end. But thank you so much, Sarah. All right. So I think next is Dr. Danishman. And yes, this slide has been used before, but it's a great slide, so I thought I'd include it again. But Dr. D, are you ready?
I am ready. Thank you. Right. And it's an honor to be here. I was always under the impression that Dean had a professional gardener, but I may have been mistaken. What I wanted to do is just kind of give you an update on from the clinic side, an update on the latest research on the vaccines and COVID treatment, especially during pregnancy, and then just a tidbit on ASRM guidelines. So in regards to clinics, most clinics are now sort of fully operational, gone back to performing IVF and embryo transfers as well. And the reason for that is because we have now more data on pregnancy. We have more data on the effects of the virus on pregnancy, the lack of vertical transmission, some treatments that could be actually afforded during pregnancy. So we feel more confident moving forward. And of course, all clinics have instituted sanitary and health measures, physical distancing in terms of intervals between patient visits, also maximizing the use of video consultations. The other thing is for your international patients, some clinics, including ours, for example, have had now instituted collaborations with our colleagues in different parts of the world. I think that it was the latter part of March when we realized that many international parents were not going to be able to come to the US, for example, for their sperm freeze or for their IVF cycles because of the travel restrictions that were about to be placed. So now we have collaborations with many colleagues in Europe and Australia and South America. So many of your intended parents still can proceed with their sperm freeze, FDA screening, and those of our patients, for example, who need IVF, where IVF is obviously a time-sensitive issue, and we have patients in their late 30s and 40s who really can't afford to wait. We can connect them to trusted colleagues in different parts of the world so that they can maximize their chance of being able to retrieve good quality eggs and create good quality embryos, and a later time that we can transfer those embryos to the US for the transfer to the surrogate. So that's good news. The other issue is that surrogates are now coming to us in terms of screening from different states. We have, again, very strict protocols. Many clinics have many strict protocols in place to protect the health of surrogates, all patients and team members. All patients that we have that are undergoing IVF have to go through mandatory COVID testing during the IVF cycle. And if they are deemed to be positive, then we will postpone and actually cancel the cycle and postpone it. In regard to surrogate testing, we don't have a universal screening for surrogates, but we discuss it with intended parents and surrogates. And if they wish to have a test done, then we perform the test at the time of endometrial uterine preparation. So that's a little update on the clinic perspective. In terms of vaccines, so far, there are 3 companies that are really leading the charge in terms of a vaccine. Pfizer in collaboration with a German biotechnology company, Moderna, which is actually a biotech company right near Dean in Massachusetts, and Johnson & Johnson. So those 3, and of course, I should say that there's a 4th one, Oxford University, that is collaborating with AstraZeneca here in the US. All 4 companies are getting very close to actually announcing the results of their phase 3 trials. This is the last step in right before the companies can come out with their vaccine and present the vaccines to the public. The phase 3 trials in all 4 cases involve 30,000 participants around the world, including places like Brazil, where there are still significant hotspots and surges in COVID-19. And the good news about all 4 vaccines was that in the phase 2 trials, in all cases, after the vaccination, after 2 vaccinations, 1 month apart, all patients, for example, in Moderna's case, all 45 participants actually created neutralizing antibodies against the spike protein, which is what we want to see. We want to see neutralizing antibodies. The other fact that was really important is in several cases, not only neutralizing antibodies were discovered in patients who were vaccinated, but also the T cells, which are a part of the immune system that fights infection, especially viral infection. The T cells were also activated. So this is really good news in regards to the ultimate phase 3 trials that we expect results for in September. So my belief is that before the end of the year, at least a couple of those companies are going to announce that their vaccines will be available. Now, the interesting thing is that all of these companies have already begun production of those vaccines, millions and millions of doses of them. They started that in June. For example, the Oxford University group had contracted with many different manufacturing companies around the globe starting in June, and they started actually producing the vaccine in millions of doses before even the phase 2 trials were completed. So that's good news because they know that once they announce and once we know that the vaccines are effective and safe, then there's going to be a significant demand globally for the vaccine. So that's a little bit on the vaccine update. In regards to COVID treatment, we haven't really had any significant progress in terms of treatment. Remdesivir is still the one that has the best studies behind it, but steroids are now currently being used with some efficacy, for example, dexamethasone. And there was a biotechnology company out of the UK that reported on beta interferon, another type of immunotherapy that we can use for patients who have severe cases of COVID-19. The pregnancy data on COVID-19, there was a study actually that came out of the CDC that showed that women who were pregnant had a higher risk of hospitalization and higher risk of ICU admission with COVID-19. Now, this was actually in contradiction to the study that was published out of Columbia University, which showed that 88% of patients who were pregnant who tested positive for COVID-19 had either no symptoms or very mild symptoms, so no different than the general population. So when we actually looked at that particular CDC study more closely, we found that unfortunately it was a flawed study, and the reason for that was because any patient who was pregnant, who was actually admitted to the hospital, whether it's for diabetes control, for high blood pressure, for preterm labor, for other medical complications, and happened to contract COVID-19 at some point during their hospitalization, they deemed that a COVID-19 complication. So that was somewhat of a flawed study. In fact, CDC has had to retract several of its announcements and studies because of the way they've been counting, for example, the number of positive cases. They've been counting antibodies as well as the acute testing. So a little bit of a egg on their face, and unfortunately for the last few announcements that they've had. The last bit is just about ASRM guidelines. No really new updates from ASRM, except for the fact that we had an update recently that stated that not only do we have to wear masks, obviously the whole team, every patient that comes into the office, but as clinicians, when we have contact with patients, we need to actually have eye protective gear as well. So now we're not only wearing masks, we're also having eye protection gear as well. So that was really the last ASRM update. And of course, we continue to monitor the studies, the vaccines, and I think overall, I'm hopeful. So very optimistic and hopeful. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thanks, Dr. D. No, I don't have a gardener. I was born and raised with the theory on life that never trust someone who never mowed their own lawn. So I've always done my own. All right, so I think up next is, let me see.
Welcome to Spotlight On.
I think it's Mr. Snyder. So I think I got you live. Are you there?
I am here, Mr. Hutchinson.
And yes, I've used this slide too, but it's so perfect that I had to do it again. So Mr. Snyder, I'm going to start you at seeds, and then when you go into the law part, I'll click over to the next slide.
That sounds great. And just for everyone's edification, I am Dean's gardener. I just arrive after dark when he is unaware. So first, in terms of seeds, to all of the agency owners and workers that are on this call, my empathy, my understanding, and my support goes out to you. These have been difficult times. You have had to master concepts from medical to legal to psychological in order to even understand how to refer your parents to the proper professionals and how to support them in their journeys. I also know that, as with many other kinds of economic entities, economics has been a difficulty. Financial support through the PPP loans and other issues have all had to be navigated, and I hope you have all had success, and I am sending you my best wishes. From the seeds perspective, it's primarily on this call simply some announcements of events that are going to come up, and buried in those events will be some COVID specific topics that will benefit you. In order to increase the educational potency and value of the seeds memberships, this month on August 19th, we are starting a series of brown bag events. Those are events that are going to be held on the third Wednesday of each month. They will be held at 11 a.m. Pacific time, and for an hour there will be various subjects covered of specific relevance to agencies. As to the COVID nature of them, the first one on August 19th is going to be insurance considerations during COVID. And we are going to see how insurance issues related to the pandemic are being handled, from disability insurance to life insurance to other types of insurance. And there will be a panel of two insurance experts and, of course, a legal expert to interpret what the insurance experts are saying, or vice versa. I'm not sure which. On September 16th at the same time, there will be an expert panel that is intended to give specific relevance to your needs. And what it is going to be is it's going to be a panel of an attorney, a psychologist, a doctor, and an agency owner. And we are going to solicit your individual questions that are relevant to your agencies, your parents, your practices, so that you can tender your questions and the panel will go through in an hour and answer them directly. That is kind of a test run, and we're going to try to do that kind of topical specific panel, every other brown bag. On October 21st, it's going to be how to boost your immune system and decrease stress during stressful times. That's partially what Allison Wilson was talking about early on, but this will be a much more in-depth covering of that topic, and it'll have a psychologist and a physician among others. We missed our conference, which means we missed the karaoke party in Anaheim. It was devastating. I know you all wanted to sing. However, there is going to be a virtual conference. It's free, as are all of the brown bag conferences. So the virtual conference is going to be held on September 11th. It is going to be 4 hours long. It will include some very interesting and relevant topics, and it will be followed by a cocktail party and lip sync singing party online. You can't possibly miss that. There will be another virtual conference. Again, no conference charge. These are things we're doing for your benefit during these difficult times, on January 22nd, 2021, and it will follow the same format. Importantly, I want everyone to understand that SEEDS is improving its structure and improving its value to its members. One of the things that we just did is we had our bylaws reviewed by a nonprofit corporate attorney to determine their sufficiency and whether they needed updating. That attorney has recommended some updates, and there are some changes we're going to be making to the bylaws. It is critical that we get a quorum to vote and return on those bylaw changes. They should be going out to membership within the next week or two for vote. Please don't ignore the emails. Please just click on the link, review the changes. If you have no objections, vote in favor, or at least make sure your vote is registered either way. That's about all I have for SEEDS, Dino. Force majeure. Do you even know what that?
It actually did say contracts too, but I must have messed up when I put the picture in. But
Yeah,
you know what you're talking about.
Yeah, can you tell me what that means?
I could, but that's why you're on this panel and I'm not. So that's what you're
All right. So I am not going to talk about the issues of parents coming into and out of the country. That's going to be Rich Vaughn. I'm going to talk about the fact that, and this is aimed at the attorneys, but the agency owners are also helped by being aware of these issues, because some of these things are things you're going to have to talk to your parents about or your surrogates as they're coming into the process. So some issues that have come up, and I am not going to assert that this is universal or all inclusive. This is what I've seen to date and the kinds of things that we've been dealing with in our contracts. So each surrogacy contract has a provision for lost wages. What happens if those lost wages are COVID related during pregnancy? Are those wages that are lost or dealt with by the surrogates vacation or sick leave benefits, or are they the responsibility of the intended parents? And I think the contracts are starting to draw distinctions between absence primarily related to the risk of COVID to pregnancy, which is one thing. That's lost wages because of the risk to the pregnancy, which is the core fundamental concept of the contract, or the general risk of COVID. In other words, would she have been off work regardless of the pregnancy, or is COVID posing an unreasonable risk because the GC is pregnant? So that analysis has to be identified as to the cause of the lost wages, and then it essentially has to be negotiated between the parties as to whose allocation of risk that's going to be. Provisions are being put in that require the carrier to follow both national and local recommendations as to precautions to avoid contracting COVID-19. And as you all know, we have a cohesive federal rule that, oh, no, we don't. we actually have no rule, and they tend to vary by state. They tend to vary by county. They tend to vary by city. So different surrogates in different places are going to have different standards of care established by the community. I think it's important to incorporate that they must comply with the standards that are applicable to them. And as an overarching recommendation, CDC and public health issuances and recommendations should be cited in the contract that she will follow them upon notice. Now, most of her behavior probably doesn't need a COVID provision at all. She is going to have a provision that has been in contracts forever that says you follow your physician's recommendations as to the care of your pregnancy. And I suspect most obstetricians are issuing proclamations for their patients as to how to insulate themselves or minimize the contracting of COVID and the effect on the pregnancy. Another issue is liability for COVID-related illness or work absence as a result of travel to the clinic. As Dr. Donishmand said, the clinics have socially distanced procedures at the clinics, but many of the surrogates have to fly to those clinics on an airline. Many of them have to stay in hotels, and there are risks of exposure. Who covers and under what conditions? One of the questions that was once asked is, what if they drive there, they get there, and for some reason there's an embargo or a limitation on travel placed at the border of a state? Those kinds of things are less likely now, but defining whether she got sick during travel to the clinic, because clearly if she contracted it in the course of her duties, it should be the responsibility of the parents. But what if she gets sick 14 days after she gets back and you're not sure whether she contracted it during the travel or after she got home? So those kinds of timelines and dates and periods of risk need to be defined in the contract. The question is, what liabilities are the intended parents willing to cover and with what reasonable limitations? And for whatever their liability they're not willing to accept, is your carrier willing to accept them on her own? Or is she desirous of delaying or avoiding travel? And each party's risk tolerance will determine the answers for that. There are also additional provisions on temporary guardianship of children should the parents be unable to arrive to birth. As to the arrival windows, I'll let Rich Vaughn talk about that. But we do need to incorporate requirements for the intended parents to designate caregivers or to enter into a conversation about who that should be. I've already heard of one case where the parents insisted against an agency's recommendation that the surrogate who gave birth be allowed to care for the children while they were delayed, and that surrogate bonded with the child and then initially contested giving up the child. So I have never been a proponent of allowing the woman that gave birth to be the caregiver. I would be very cautious about that. At the very least, I'd require additional psychological evaluation before that occurs, and a number of indemnification documents in place ahead of time. You also need to make sure the carrier is absolved from responsibility to care for the child in the IP's absence, as long as they put an alternative guardian in place. Hold harmless and release provisions for the surrogate or whoever is the guardian, and the whole issue of if the surrogate contracts COVID and then her family contracts it from her, what happens with the concentric rings of exposure and economic effect? Can you obligate GC's children and others living in her household to follow the COVID precautions? They're not parties to the contract. You can't guarantee that they're going to comply, but those kinds of issues should be discussed between the parties. That's just a very surface treatment. Many of those concepts go deeper with tendrils that branch out from them. They are things you should be discussing as attorneys with other attorneys. If you're not certain how to handle them, we'll all share our experience. If you're agency owners, you should be talking very carefully with the attorneys that you work with on a regular basis to make sure you understand these things and can talk cogently with the parties about them. Thanks, Dean.
Thanks, Steve. And again, like everyone else, Steve will be on for questions at the end. So let me just unmute Rich, who I think is self-muted too. So Rich, you may have to. Let me see. Can you hear me, Rich?
Yeah, there we go.
There we go.
All right, well, hi everybody, and thanks again for having me on as one of the speakers. I'm going to try to do what I was instructed to do, which is to focus only on changes since our last meeting. So as I skim through this stuff, if you find that you need other details that I've skipped over, either ask at the end or feel free to contact me separately and I'll be happy to help you out. First and foremost, in a very significant update, I believe Dean Hutchison has now learned how to say force majeure and laissez-passer, but I'm not sure he's mastered how to pronounce brown bag with a Minnesota dialect.
And I know, I will get that from Steve.
All right, in a more serious note, the presidential proclamations that outline these travel bans have been expanded in May. Brazil was added to the list of countries that are subject to the entry ban. And on June 22nd, the president also signed a proclamation, which ultimately doesn't have an impact on us, but it extends a prior proclamation suspending the entry of certain additional foreign nationals to the US through the end of the year who were deemed a risk to American jobs. And this was for various H1, H1B, H2B, J and L visas. Those are all working visas. This did not affect the B2 visa. This is the tourist visa, which typically allows someone to stay up to about 180 days. And that's the visa on which many of our clients from other countries are coming to the US. So that's still safe. The list of approved airports that are approved for international travel or receiving international travelers in the US was increased from 13 airports to 15 now. If you have a client that's traveling from a country that's not subject to a travel ban, they're probably not going to have too many issues getting here other than showing that they've self-isolated for a period of 14 days or have a plan to self-isolate once they get here. There are two exceptions to the presidential proclamation travel bans that have been working to get clients here: the national interest exception and the exception that allows a parent or guardian of a US citizen child unmarried under the age of 21 to travel. Both of those were being fleshed out in March, April, and even in early May. And there have been some consistent developments with how they're processed now. So basically, those are the two that have been working the most for our clients. If you're looking to travel or have a client travel under a national interest exception, the argument is that it is in the national interest of the US that these parents be allowed to be here, to make medical decisions for the child, and to take the child from the hospital so that the US healthcare resources are not further burdened during this public healthcare crisis. As far as the timeline goes for getting this exception and this approval, we still suggest preparing 3 months before birth, and you're aiming to prepare a file to send to the local embassy or consulate in the client's home country 6 weeks before birth. And that is to apply for travel permission for 1 month before birth, to allow 2 weeks for the client to quarantine when they get here and 2 weeks in case the birth occurs early. Now, I recommend not bothering the embassy prior to 6 weeks before birth. In some cases, maybe 7 weeks, but they're dealing with thousands and thousands of travel emergencies due to COVID. If you apply too early, it may go into an unimportant pile. I've had a few files that were lost and I've had to resubmit everything because it just got to them too early. The file that you need to send to the embassy is a Form G28. That's a Department of Homeland Security form that allows you as an attorney to represent the client before the embassy. You need to send copies of the client's passports, visas, and ESTAs, pre-birth order if you have it, or post-birth order and or powers of attorney and guardianship documents, The embassies do want to see a copy of the surrogacy agreement. We typically send an attorney letter that sort of summarizes everything, a medical letter that summarizes why there is a national interest in the clients coming here to take care of the baby and relieve the healthcare system. You also have to supply a signed COVID-19 form with a quarantine plan. And the quarantine is at the final destination, not at the airport where they first land, but at their final destination. And this COVID-19 form should also indicate their current COVID health status and whether they've had any COVID testing. In some cases, the clients are being asked to apply for a visa, even if they're in a visa waiver country. So if that's being required, you would need to submit the DS-160, that's the visa application confirmation page and confirmation of the visa appointment, so that they have that in front of them when they're looking at the case. Some embassies have actually been skipping the appointment process. Early on in this COVID time, the embassies were granting appointments for the clients to go there in person to review the file, review all the paperwork, and then give them approval. It seems that in the last 6 to 8 weeks, they've not been asking for appointments. They've been granting the approval based on an email review and then telling the clients in an email that they're approved to travel, in which case the clients should print that email from the embassy and take all of their documents with them that were submitted on their behalf to the embassy, so that they can be prepared for interviews, possibly at both airports where they're leaving from and where they're arriving. Most are being interviewed upon arrival in the US, but I just got an email today from a client who was interviewed at both airports, both in London and in Chicago. The other exception is the exception for a parent or guardian of a US citizen child. That was always fairly straightforward in application, but there wasn't a clear process until about mid-June. And it should be pretty easy for the clients to get approval. And in fact, many of the embassies have said, you don't need to ask us for permission, you're allowed. But they do recommend that the clients, if they have a US citizen child that is under 21 and not married, then they don't check in for their flight online. They get to the airport early and be prepared to go through an interview. They need to show the passport and the birth certificate of that US citizen child. The child does not have to be present. And they should try to have an original certified copy of the birth certificate that was specifically requested by the airports in China. That's not been requested in other airports that I'm aware of, but I think it's a good idea if they could get a certified original copy of their US citizen child's birth certificate. For intended parents who were perhaps single when their first US citizen child was born and have since married, these step parents who are not on the birth certificate may be allowed to travel as long as they show their marriage certificate. All right, now those are the updates, any changes in regard to getting them here. In terms of getting them home from the US passports are still significantly delayed. And a lot of this information I'm about to share with you is courtesy of Mark Gilland at Passport and Visa Advisors. He basically has outlined that, for all of us, if you've received his letters, in June, the Department of Consular Affairs announced a 3-phase plan to reopen for full services, and phase 3 is where 100% of their workforce is at work and passport expediting has been resumed. So in the phasing, they've got, of the 26 passport agencies in the US, currently only 12 are at phase 1 and 6 are at phase 2. Just this week, El Paso and Dallas opened, but we still have closed passport offices: Atlanta, Miami, Houston, Tucson, San Diego, LA, San Francisco, and Seattle. They're still closed. They will take appointments, but only in very limited circumstances. And all of these passport agencies will not move to full phase 3 until all 26 agencies are at phase 2. And then at that point, they'll move to phase 3 in unison. There's no clear indicator as to when that's going to be. There was sort of a guess that they might be returning to normal operations within the next 6 to 8 weeks, but we'll see. They've said that before. So that's the update on US passports. As an alternative to getting people home, they may be able to get passports from their home countries. This hasn't really changed much. We've still seen Australia, Germany, Spain, and the UK issuing home country passports as long as it's clear that the child is a citizen of those countries, depending on genetics often. And for other clients where the babies may not qualify for a home country passport, emergency travel documents and a laissez-passer have worked. And in this situation, you apply to your home country consulate here in the US for the laissez-passer or the emergency travel documents. And typically they want to see the birth certificate. Sometimes they want to see it apostilled. Sometimes they'll forgive that requirement of the apostille, especially if there are delays in getting the apostille. Many Secretary of State's offices have been closed and not issuing apostilles except by mail. So sometimes they've been forgiving that apostille requirement. We've even had a couple of cases where the birth certificate was not required by the home country consulate because the vital records office was closed. Those are exceptions to the rule. So the client should be prepared to at least present the birth certificate, maybe the court judgment, and then get those emergency travel documents to go home. And that's all I've got.
Thanks, Rich. I'll just have some anecdotal things, particularly on the U.S. passport, and I'll speak from our experience so far, and I'm lucky to have a great team around me too, 7 amazing attorneys that I work with, but we've had some luck with these expedited passports in different U.S. passport agencies where instead of kind of rolling the dice and applying for the slow one and hope it comes early, where people have continued to call and got a receptive person at the U.S. passport office with either a doctor's note regarding the child, but we've also seen now doctor's note regarding either one of the intended parents where they may have some type of comorbidity that they'd be better for them to get home, or we've even had someone who had a family member at home in their home country that had issues, and the U.S. passport department granted them an expedited passport appointment. So we've seen some, at least parents that, kind of push the envelope and call every day and get a receptive person on the other line at the National Passport Office, and then they get an expedited appointment. So it's not everyone particularly, but we've had some luck as of recent with a couple cases.
Yeah, I mean, I can add on to that and say that we've had clients that have been real pests and have not gotten a sympathetic ear. But if they've had a life or death emergency that could be certified in writing by a physician, whether it's for the parents or extended family member, like a death in the family where someone's about to die, or it's something about the health and well-being of the child that can be certified in writing by a doctor, then that has worked as a basis for getting an emergency passport. There's a process for that. You have to have a flight that's leaving within 72 hours. You have to first have a call with the National Passport Information Center, and they will assess the legitimacy of your emergency. They will ask you a lot of questions about the emergency. If they agree that there's an emergency, then they will immediately get you an appointment at a passport office, often the next day. So the client needs to be prepared to go wherever that is. And they can often get the passport the same day as their passport appointment, as long as they've cleared that first hurdle of proving that they've got a medical emergency.
Yeah. And like you said, they have to know the risk that they may be purchasing a plane ticket they can't use. So it's that weighing of the risk issue. But yeah, so that's good. And then the other thing we've been advising IPs too that are particularly or have started to advise ones that are going home on non-US passports because it is a technical violation of US immigration code, is if they can at least submit the application while they're in the US for the slow US passport. So if there is ever a potential issue in the future when they come back to the States, they can have a little bit beefed up explanation that they applied for the US passport. They were told it was going to take 7 to 12 or 12 to 17 weeks, and they didn't want to overstay their other visas and were able to travel home on a home passport. So it's just one little tidbit to add, that even if your parents are getting home passports or emergency travel documents from their home country, have them try and apply for the US passport while they're still in the States, to just have an added argument if there's ever any negative implication to leaving the States without a US passport. So I'm gonna now just open up everyone's mic, so everyone's gonna be live, and I'll open up the question box. I don't know if it's been populated or not. but let me see. And if it hasn't, then feel free to ask any questions. Looks like we have some. So for anyone on the call, has any agency, provider, or professional had a GC contract COVID-19? How did you navigate that experience with all the parties? So if anyone wants to jump in first.
I think I would be a rude person and take your shirt. What do you think I am?
That was not the answer we were looking for.
No.
But I mean, I can speak. Currently, we haven't, knock on wood, haven't had a case yet. I'm sure it's inevitable since it's everywhere, but we've been lucky. But I don't know if anyone has had a case where any of their clients have a surrogate or their agencies had a surrogate or anyone's had that case.
Dino, we have had a surrogate contract COVID, and it's been a mild case. She's been quarantining at home and she's doing well, and the parents are in communication, and we have her in appropriate medical care, and it is not causing anything untoward at this point in time.
Dr. Danishman, do you have anything in place with the European counterparts for patients needing the SPAR process, or do you know if Bedford SPAR is allowing anyone to send sperm without the testing or without the usual SPAR process testing?
That's a great question. So after a significant amount of work and meetings between our colleague in Europe and Dr. Kiesling at Bedford, we now do have a protocol in place where intended parents can actually in Europe freeze their sperm, and then part of the sample, the ejaculate, is going to be sent over to Bedford for DNA testing, and then once it clears, then it's transported to the clinic. And we have that not only in Europe, but we also have it in Australia as well, and so so that's in place, and I can certainly, direct any agencies or any patients towards that particular clinic and the protocol.
Right. Another question. So the question was, sperm and embryos can now be shipped to the U.S. from overseas, or is there a restriction for tissue right now?
It all depends on which particular country. In the majority of European countries, we cannot freeze sperm. The protocols that have actually, in collaborations we've placed, are between us and those particular collaborators, whether they are in Europe or in Australia and other countries. So you would have to speak to that particular clinic in terms of whether they have a protocol in place or they have a collaboration in place with particular clinics. But most clinics will not freeze sperm. There's been a lot of work that's been done between some of the clinics in the US and some of their counterparts in Europe and other countries in order to place these protocols, but those agreements are only between those particular clinics and those centers, so they're not going to potentially apply to, let's say, another clinic somewhere else. So just check with your clinic, with whichever clinic you're working with, to see if they have those collaborations in place.
There's a question, I don't know if you have an answer, but do you know if the 4 vaccines are different from each other or how they differ in terms of makeup?
That's a great question. So 2 of the vaccines, which are the Pfizer and the Moderna, are mRNA vaccine. They're messenger RNA vaccines. So essentially what happens is they have to be taken, when they're injected, they're actually taken up into the cell, into the nucleus of the cell, where that messenger RNA then gets translated into a protein, which is the spike protein of the virus. And then that protein essentially is produced. And then the body recognizes that protein as foreign, so it mounts an immune response. And then you have these neutralizing antibodies that start forming. The other technology that's being used by the Oxford group is by taking a part of the protein and actually embedding it into an adenovirus, which is a common cold virus, and then injecting that cold virus which is essentially an inactivated cold virus. So it's not like you're going to catch a cold or flu, but it's an inactivated virus that's injected. That particular virus then is going to produce the protein, and that's actually not the protein that's embedded in the adenovirus, it's the DNA of the spike protein. So then what happens is that virus starts production in the body of the person of that particular protein. Again, the body recognizes the protein as foreign, mounts an immune response and antibodies, and that's how they become immune. So the two of the groups have the messenger RNA, the other groups have the DNA. So it's two different ways and mechanisms by which you can mount an immune response. The traditional method of having, for example, an antigen of the virus or an inactivated antigen of the virus, a part of the virus injected, takes a much longer time in terms of its platform to introduce a vaccine. These DNA and messenger RNA-based platforms are faster in terms of their technology to be able to get the vaccine out to the public.
Another question for you. If one has to go to an appointment in a hospital or doctor's office, should they be wearing protective eye gear, face shield or goggles, or anything above and beyond that?
I believe you should. I think you should wear a mask if you're going to anywhere that's potentially higher risk, which is a hospital or visiting a physician's office, any place which you think is higher risk. Then eye and goggles or protective gear that'll protect your eyes, because obviously the virus can enter through the mucous membranes, orally, through the nasally, and then through the eyes as well. Less so through the eyes because it's mostly nasal mucosa and oral, but it's still a good idea to protect yourself if you're going into higher risk areas.
So the next question is probably more legal, and Rich and Steve can jump in as well, but there's a question: has anyone done a temporary guardianship? Surprisingly, we have to do our first one. Any suggestions or must-have? So I would say suggestion one, obviously any background checks and stuff you can get on the temporary guardian if it's someone not known to the family, but secondary, definitely reach out to lawyers in your state, because there's probably specifics that need to be in it on a state-by-state basis. I know Steve will probably say something similar, and Rich, but I'll let you guys jump in too.
Yeah, the guardianship process is tricky. Historically, in these situations, some very informal guardianship documents have been used, similar to what parents give to grandparents to transfer authority to make decisions and care for the child when they go on vacation. There isn't a lot of requirement or screening. There's no court approval. From a liability perspective and from a safety perspective, remember, typically when children are put into the care of foster parents or other guardians for any period of time, those people have gone through criminal background checks and background studies and home studies. So some due diligence that's going to meet a reasonable standard of care. And I would maintain that certainly a criminal background check and things like that should be done on the people that are volunteering. The guardianship documents should address liability for things that happen and whether the caregiver is insulated from liability unless it's gross negligence or intentional conduct. So you can use a very informal guardianship document and get legal authority transferred. I don't recommend that. I recommend some screening and a broader document.
Yeah, and what I would add to that is that if there's a situation where the parents aren't going to be there for a while, to include guardian or the person with the temporary power of attorney has authority to apply for the passport for the child.
So there's a comment just on the Australian IVF. So if these sperm freezes and shipping, we're getting some back feed somewhere. I'll mute everyone and then take them off as the questions come up. So there's a comment just to be careful if you're trying to send sperm from Australia, because the Australian government is putting a stop to these type of sperm freezes at the moment and getting legal advice to see if clinics can do it um, for international surrogacy. So particularly from Australia, make sure it's okay to send the sperm that's frozen here. Rich, there's a question to you. Can you specifically talk about getting an IP home from China? And I'm wondering if it's both ways, getting here or getting both here and home from China. Let's see. I think you're self-muted at the moment, so I'm not in trouble anymore. You there now?
There we go. Yeah, the process of getting intended parents from China approved to travel here is the same as it is in other parts of the world. They have to contact the local embassy or consulate, go through the same process that I've outlined before, or go to another country that's not subject to the travel ban and be there for 14 days and then travel to the US. We've found, obviously there's a cultural difference in how China has approached COVID versus how the US has approached COVID. So we find that even if we can get them approved, there are some parents from China who just will not take the risk of traveling to the US because of COVID. They don't want to come over here and get it. They don't want to bring it back. So you've got that just sort of cultural difference in how they look at COVID versus what we've done. Aside from that, getting them home requires that they go to the Chinese consulate to get travel documents, and they have to have the child's birth certificate in order to do that. And now the Chinese consulates are also closed, but you can get an appointment. And one of the things that the clients have to do is there's a WeChat code for the consulate, and they have to check in every day for 14 days and indicate their temperature and their health status. And if they miss a day, they have to repeat. They might be given a one-time permission to miss a day, but if they miss 2 days in a row of self-reporting, then they have to start over. And then after they've completed that 14-day health reporting, then they can get an appointment at the Chinese consulate for the travel documents for the baby.
Next question, let's see. In case of a single parent who got married before coming over for a second child, is it enough to get married without having completed the step-parent adoption? I'm guessing this is to use the exception to get this non-bio dad here. Rich, you can jump in, but I'll say from our experience, we had a case where it was two dads that just hadn't completed their second parent adoption at all. Only one was on the initial birth certificate with their 2-year-old son, and they were told by the French consulate that it didn't matter. They had a marriage certificate. That child they were a step parent, and they could travel without the need of the adoption being completed. And I don't know if Rich or Steve has had that same experience.
Yeah, that's been our experience as well, just the marriage license.
Yep, and that has been our client's experience as well.
If you use the citizen child exception, the child doesn't have to appear. Does that mean the child doesn't have to travel? How do you explain travel under the exception if the child is not with you?
Real easy.
Yeah.
You're like, I don't want to bring my child to the US and risk the child getting COVID. I want to leave the child at home where the child is safe.
Yeah, and they don't need because they are outside of the travel ban, they technically don't need an exemption. So you're not really filing for any type of exemption. They should only have to travel on an ESTA visa, a normal visa, or if they're coming from a different country that doesn't have ESTA visa, it's just a normal travel visa as a non or as an exempted party already. They're outside the travel ban.
Right, it's not a national exception exemption, and that is correct. So I have a question to Rich and to you. Have you been told, because my lovely daughter Keely, who actually briefed me on most of this, as she is always doing, has been told, and we've been advised that the national exception is only good for one entry into the US within 30 days of the grant of the exception. Have you heard that?
Yes. Yes, in fact, in some of our cases, the embassy, it's kind of funny. It looks like they use a piece of scissors or a pair of scissors to cut off a piece of 8 by 11 with a note, a handwritten or typed note with some dates filled in. It says this national interest exception is good for one entry. You must go within 30 days. So I've seen that in, I don't know, 4 or 5 cases.
Mhm.
Let's see. For intended parents wanting to start a surrogacy process right now, are there any countries that attorneys advise should absolutely just hold off until the climate changes? I mean, I speak from our experience. We have not said no to anyone in the sense that as long as they understand there may be delays and it may take longer, if they want to start and get going and they happen to be in a country or near a country where they can potentially send their do their sperm work or FDA freezing if it's allowed, and if they're with a U.S. clinic that allows it, it's, you know, they may not have to travel to the U.S. at all until birth, but you know, advising what's going on now and what the travel's like and what the potential negatives are, then I don't know if there's any specific country other than maybe China where it's probably harder to get here. That there's a full advise on not to start the process.
Well, if you think about it logically, the issues for starting a surrogacy journey are first of all engaging with your professionals, and you can do that electronically. And then the next stage that Saeed has addressed is, can you get your sperm or your embryos here for the transfer? And that's being worked out with a collaboration from global clinics that are taking those components locally to the intended parents and then sending them over, which means the contracts and matching with the surrogate, the transfer of the embryo, and the entire process can happen without any travel at all until the birth. And if you give average times for that process to unfold from start to finish, I think most people are going to say 18 to 24 months average. And Lord knows in 18 to 24 months, hopefully most of this is going to be highly relaxed. So I think there's a practical aspect to it. Now, am I naive to say that? Possibly.
I think in March and April we were saying, and maybe by the end of August things will be back to normal.
Yeah. Well, I'm not committing to that. I'm just throwing that out there as a possible analysis structure.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So it's there. I mean, as long as you give everyone all the information and you're advising them on what the situation is here, and you know they can speak to an attorney in their home country, et cetera. You know, if they want to start, they want to start. And as Steve said, and other people said here, there's ways to get the whole process moving along. You know, in the meantime, and they can do a lot virtual. I mean, I guess I used to hate being on Zoom and Skype all the time, but we're very lucky to have it now because the relationships too, and with their surrogates, their donors, their team at their agencies, their lawyers is, you know, they're probably getting more face-to-face contact now than before. So there's a question on, do we have any updates or advice getting American IPs into Canada for a surrogate birth in Canada and their return to the US? I believe Canada has been much like the US in getting people, you know, allowing exemptions in for surrogacy births. I don't have Sarah Cohen's contact information on me right now, but whoever asked this question, if you just Google Sarah Cohen, Toronto surrogacy law, reach out directly to her. I'm sure she'd have more advice, and she's probably been dealing with getting parents to Canada. I know Canada out front though was you know, was allowing for travel exemptions to get in. Getting back to the US, if they're US citizens, it shouldn't be, I shouldn't say it shouldn't be an issue because who knows, but it shouldn't be. I know today a lot of people were up in arms, or at least we got a bunch of random emails in because the New York Times and BBC and I believe other news sources reported that inside the Trump White House, there's discussion about a travel ban for American citizens who may reasonably believe to have either been exposed or have COVID to get to the US or come to the US. So there was this potential travel ban on American citizens now. It's hopefully just a sensationalized puff piece, but God knowing what's been going on, it's probably some truth to it. But that would be the only thing I could see that could potentially impact a return home. So I don't know if anyone else has dealt with that on this call, Rich or Steve, with getting people to Canada or home from Canada.
No,
I have not. Have you, Rich?
no, I haven't. But I mean, it would depend on how that new ban gets written, because the current proclamation says if you're a U.S. citizen, you can get back here.
Right. And air travel has always been open from Canada to the U.S., right? I mean, you can get here. It's just the land travel from Canada to the U.S. has been closed. I think air travel has been open the whole time. Not vice versa, though, not U.S. to Canada, but Canada to U.S. Has anyone had any experience or luck with Chinese IPs who have green cards currently living in China, getting back into China with their child? I haven't had that specific case.
Neither have I.
I haven't had to deal with it yet. I have a client who fits that description who is worried about getting back. But the birth hasn't happened yet, so we haven't quite gotten there.
Okay. Has anyone had the discussion with their clients about moving embryos to a clinic closer to GC for transfers rather than GC having to travel to where the embryos are? I mean, from our experience, we've definitely talked about it, and we've had parents or intended parents and surrogates bring it up as well, that if there was a good clinic nearby that they all trusted and they were okay with, asked about how to do it and what the process would be. So it's definitely come up, and we have had at least one set of parents do so. But I'll open it up to others on the call to answer as well. And that looks like the last. Well, someone responded that they've had people do that as well, and there's just obviously there's a cost. So there's a shipping cost that I'm going to guess would be range probably from $500 to $1,000 or so internally in the United States to ship those embryos. Again, you want to make sure all the parties are okay with it, and they've fully vetted the other clinics that would potentially be involved. There's a question, in these cases, have the clinics that have the embryos and created the embryos agreed to the move? I think for the most part, the only time I've had issues is the vice versa, where some clinics don't want to transfer embryos that they didn't create, that they didn't have full control over the medication process, the retrieval, and the embryo creation. But I haven't ever had a case where a clinic wouldn't allow intended parents to move their embryos. If Rich or Steve or Saeed, I think I've muted you, so I can unmute you too.
I think the only concern that I would have is that the clinics can have sort of varying protocols for freezing of the embryos and then subsequent thawing. They could have different sort of criteria for endometrial preparation for the surrogate. So there has to be a discussion with the intended parents in regards to transportation of the embryos. And I think that there are some clinics that collaborate on a frequent basis, and they're very familiar with each other's protocols. And in those particular instances, there may not be any risk in transportation, and then subsequently any diminution of pregnancy success rates if the embryos are transported. But it's really a discussion that needs to be had by the physicians and the intended parents, so they can understand the potential risks.
Said, I had a question. It kind of pertains to that, but if you create the embryos and a different clinic transfers them or implants them, how does the success rate on like a SART or something go? Who is responsible for those embryos?
So the SART counts that as our pregnancy rate. not the clinic that transferred the embryo.
Saeed, when you've been getting embryos from outside the country, have any of the clinics you've approached cited legal reasons for not being able to transfer sperm or embryos? I've heard, at least anecdotally, one clinic wouldn't do it because since surrogacy was illegal and restricted, if the donor or the provider admitted he was sending it over here for surrogacy, they couldn't send it because they were not allowed to facilitate that process. Have you had that come up in your negotiations at all?
Absolutely. That's a great point, Steve, because there are some clinics and there are particular countries where there are regulations against non-altruistic or commercial surrogacy. So in those particular instances, the clinics may actually ask either, number one, flatly refuse to transport the embryos. Number two, they may ask the clinic that is receiving the embryos for a letter stating that these embryos will not be used in a commercial surrogacy process. So that we have had that experience with in certain countries with certain clinics. Other clinics, frankly, that I've had discussions with in terms of, sort of doctor-to-doctor discussions, have asked me to ask the intended parents not to mention anything about the reason why they're transporting the embryos, just to mention that they would like to transport the embryos to another center. And as long as there's no further discussions about the reasons for transportation, those particular doctors are okay with transportation of the embryos, because otherwise they have to make a note in their charts as to, if there's any further discussions with the intended parents. They're not going to ask the intended parents, and they don't want the intended parents to volunteer that information.
Yeah, so that's a really good point of information for all of the professionals to know, so that as you're working with international parents, you can make sure that they're apprised of that as early in the contact process for a U.S. surrogacy as possible, so that if the clinic they're working at wants that wall of silence, they don't inadvertently penetrate it before they understand the consequences.
Rich and Steve, you can jump on this. The question is, I know that a lot of this has been surrogate focused, but how are attorneys addressing travel cost responsibility should egg donors get stuck in a traveling state due to a donor cycle for retrieval as quarantines change?
Cricket.
Well, I'll tell you, I had a similar kind of question come up in a surrogacy about whether the surrogate was required by state law to quarantine upon arrival because she was having to travel. And if so, that quarantine period would be 2 weeks, and then she's in town for that 2 weeks plus another week for the transfer, and that could end up becoming a 20-day trip instead of the typical kind of 5-day trip. And they decided not to do it.
Yeah, I think obviously if that's the case, the agency or clinic that's facilitating the travel have to make sure the intended parents know that that's an additional financial burden, and the agreements for expenses need to reflect those kinds of things. That falls under the negotiation of allocation of expenses for travel and getting stuck in states, but it's not really any different than a gestational carrier agreement.
Yeah, and I think similarly, I think particularly agencies that are working with the different clinics should try and get as much information in advance, because there is this potential, and I don't think it falls on the agency, but maybe other parties, but this informed consent that if the intended parents and surrogate knew before the cycle schedule comes out that the clinic has a brand new protocol that's going to be an extra 2 weeks and going to require all extra money for testing, et cetera, and never really informed of that before suddenly getting a cycle schedule and starting medications, you want all that, as much knowledge before, so they can say, all right, we're going to hold off, like Rich said, or we'll go through with it and pay the extra money and have something in writing and who's responsible for these costs. Because it's, I think initially back in March, April, suddenly we were getting letters from clinics that, oh yeah, we're going to go forward with this, and this is what your parents and your surrogate have to do, and it's and a giant extra financial burden they had no clue was coming.
Yep.
Yeah. But that looks like the last of the questions. So I want to thank all the panelists. I want to kind of echo what Steve said earlier. It's been a pretty insane last 5 months. It's amazing what all the different parties involved in these processes has gone through, especially those who are the service providers in this industry that are dealing with your own things at home, dealing with stresses through the roof. Homeschooling, not homeschooling, stress of traveling, taking on the stress of all of our clients in different capacities, helping people get to the country. It's pretty amazing how we've kind of all been surviving and helping each other. And I hope all these meetings continue, and through SEEDS, through ABA, through these calls, I hope we can continue on. As I mentioned earlier too, if you have other topics that are coming up that you want to hear about, or speakers you'd love to hear that we could potentially get to come on to one of these, or even SEEDS can get, or another entity can get that we can put on, we'd love to have your input. So thank you everyone, and hopefully in 2021 we'll get to see each other in person somewhere, and not just on webinars and video cams, etc.
Virtual hugs, everybody.
Yes, and cheers. Virtual cheers too.
Virtual cheers and hugs to everyone.
All right.
Bye everybody.